Today's movie I will be reviewing is the 2004 disaster movie, The Day After Tomorrow, starring Dennis Quaid, Jake Gyllenhaal, and directed by Roland Emmerich. Yeah, that movie. But anyways, what is the plot of this movie? Well, the plot of this movie is as follows. When global warming triggers a new ice age, tornadoes flatten Los Angeles, a tidal wave engulfs New York City, and the entire northern hemisphere begins to freeze solid. Now, climatologist Jack Hall, played by Dennis Quaid, and his son Sam, played by Jake Gyllenhaal, and a small group of survivors must ride out the growing superstorm to stay alive. Now, how was this movie made? Well, in 2002, 20th Century Fox bought the rights to the 1999 novel The Coming Global Storm by Whitney Strieber. And in 2002, that same year, 20th Century Fox hired Roland Emmerich to direct the movie due to his very big success with the 1996 movie Independence Day starring Will Smith. Principal photography began on November 7th, 2002. The majority of the filming took place in Montreal and Toronto, Canada, before eventually wrapped up on October 18, 2003. When the movie was released in the US on May 24, 2004, it received mixed reviews from critics and audiences. However, that did not stop the movie from being a big hit at the box office, making $552.6 million worldwide on a $125 million budget. And this movie over the years has gained a cult following. As for my reaction, this is honestly one of the better disaster movies out there, for reasons that I'm going to get into, and I've always liked this movie. So, anyways, the movie starts off in Antarctica, where a group of scientists named Jack, Jason, and Frank are in Antarctica, and we are introduced to our main character of the movie, Jack Hall, played by Dennis Quaid, who is a climatologist. And while this is going on, one of Jack's friends, Jason, is drilling ice, and the ice starts to crack going Jason's direction, meaning an ice quake is about to happen, which, of course, starts our first disaster scene of the movie. And during this scene, Jason is holding on the drill, and Jack tells him to let go of the drill, which he does. And Jack rescues Jason, and I gotta say, that is a very intense scene. And then, of course, there's the part where Jack is holding on to, equipment, and, Jason, Frank yells at him, "You're not gonna make it," and stuff like that. And then Jack runs across, he jumps to the other side, makes it, but then Jack falls, and we think for a second that he's gonna die, but he uses, kind of like a pickaxe model. Not really a pickaxe, but something like it. And he basically to hang on the side of the wall. And Jason basically tells him to grab his hand. And Jack basically does. And then he uses the tool to prevent himself from falling. And then his friend pulls him up. Again, very intense, well done scene. We then cut to a scene in New Delhi where Jack is having a conference on global warming and gives a scientific explanation on how once the warm air is gone, another ice age will begin. And then Jack says, "I do not know when it'll happen. Maybe 100 years, maybe 1,000. But what I do know is if we do not act on this soon, it'll be our children and grandchildren who will have to pay the price." But of course, no one, not even the vice president, listens to Jack. Then we are introduced to Professor Terry Rapson, who is played by Ian Holm, who I've always liked as an actor, who is going to be someone working with Jack throughout the course of the movie. One of my favorite scenes in the movie is in Tokyo, where a Japanese man is sitting down eating at an outdoor restaurant, but then he leaves and he gets a call from his wife. Asking if he will come home. And the man says that he is just leaving the office. Then a very large hailstone lands on top of a car window, making everyone stop what they're doing, and they all look at it in surprise. And then multiple large hailstones start falling out of the sky, knocking out a cop, destroying power lines, knocking over signs, and even makes a motorcycle rider crash into a glass window and all sorts of chaos. An old man and a little boy are hiding underneath a large truck, and the Japanese man, while still on the phone in his hand that his wife is calling him on, decides to make a run for it, but he gets hit on the head hard by a hailstone, and then he basically falls over to his death with his wife still on the line. Again, very intense scene. Jack gets home, and we are introduced to Sam, played by a young Jake Gyllenhaal, who plays Jack's son in the movie. We are also introduced to Dr. Lucy Hall, who is Sam's mom and Jack's wife, played by Sela Ward. Jack calls Lucy, talking about how Sam has an F on his report card and how it is unlike Sam, as he is a straight A student. Lucy decides to ask Jack if he can take Sam to the airport in the morning, as Sam joined the scholastic team, basically competing in New York, and so Jack agrees. The next morning, while Jack is giving his son Sam a ride to the airport, he says, "I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed." And then Sam says, "Here's my side of it. I got every question right on the exam, and the only reason the teacher failed me is because I didn't write out the solutions." And Jack says, "Why not?" And then Sam says, "I do them in my head." And then Jack says, "Did you tell him that?" And then Sam says, "Yes. He didn't believe me. He said if I can't do them in my head, then I must be cheating." And then Jack says, "Well, that's ridiculous. How can he fail you for being smarter than he is?" And then Sam says, "That's what I said." And then Jack says, "Sam, I'm sorry I jumped to conclusions." And FYI, Jack has been away for months from the house because of his type of job. He then drops Sam off at the airport, and I gotta say, the scene where Sam, Laura, and Brian are sitting together on the airplane in a very cloudy, stormy area, and suitcases fall out, making everyone think that the plane is going to crash, and Laura is holding on to Sam's hand. Again, very intense scene, but of course they survive, and the plane does too. We then see Sam and his friends in a taxi on the way to the exam building, and there's a man pushing a shopping cart with a dog in it. And while this is going on, Sam and his friends are very late and only 2 blocks away. They decide to walk, and the dog in the man's shopping cart starts barking sporadically as there are thousands of birds in the sky that sound panicked flying away from the city. And throughout this scene, you just get this sense of dread. Sam and his friends do the exam, and we cut to a scene where Sam and his 2 friends and all the students are in the party room. Later that night, Jack gets a phone call from Terry. Terry says to Jack, "Sorry to call you so early. We found something extraordinary and disturbing. You recall what you said in New Delhi about how polar melting might disrupt the North Atlantic current?" And then Jack says, "Yeah." And then Professor Terry, played by Ian Holmes, says, "Well, I think it's happening." And then Jack says, "What do you mean?" And then Terry says, one of our nomad buoys registered a 13 degree drop in surface temperature the other day. I sent you an email." And then Jack says, "Hold on," and he gets out of bed in his underwear and he looks at his computer, and then Jack says, "This is unbelievable." And then Terry says, "You predicted it would happen." Jack says, "Yeah, but not in our lifetime. This is too fast." Terry says, "Nothing like this has happened before." And then Jack says, "At least not for 10,000 years, referring to the Ice Age. And I like the scene 26 minutes and 13 seconds into the movie where we see a tornado forming in Los Angeles. Then there's the scene where a tornado destroys the Hollywood sign, and the news reporter on the helicopter says, "The Hollywood sign is gone. It is just shredded." And then we cut to Jack and other people watching the news in shock. And I like the scene where the two tornadoes strike Los Angeles airport and the two tornadoes form together to make one large tornado. That was cool. Tommy, the news reporter, said in one scene, the news reporter, Tommy, says, "If you look behind me, that's a tornado. Yes, a twister in Los Angeles. It is one of many tornadoes that are destroying our city. There's another one. That's the LA skyline. It's unbelievable. It's huge. It looks like some huge, horrific, terrifying nightmare, only this is the real thing." And then the sign of a woman hits Tommy, resulting in his death, and that's a very well done scene. Then there's the scene where a janitor is in the LA skyline way high up in the air. He's walking down the hallway and he opens up the door only to see the floor next to him as well as most of the side of the building is destroyed. We cut to a scene where Sam, Brian, Laura, and everyone else is watching the news. Brian changes the channels and he finds out that all flights have been canceled as 2 planes were found severely damaged in the Midwest. And Jack points out how way too much during a scene where Jack is having a meeting, Jack points out how way too much fresh water has been dumped into the ocean, which could be causing polar ice caps to melt, which may be behind this, as he stated. And he basically states that he got a call from Professor Terry last night, and Jack says Helen had some pretty convincing data. They have asked me to feed it into my paleoclimate model to track it to the next set of events. And then someone says to Jack, "Are you suggesting that these events are going to continue?" And then Jack says, "Not just continue, get worse. I think we are on the verge of a major climate shift." And now Janet, one of the scientists, said, "I think your theory may be correct. The hail, the tornadoes, it all fits." And we cut to a scene with Jack's wife, Dr. Lucy, who visits a kid named Peter in a hospital asking how he is. And Peter says, "A little better." And then Dr. Lucy says, "That's good." She then checks his heart with a heart scope. And Peter is holding a Peter Pan book. And Dr. Lucy says, "Can you read that?" And then Peter says, "No, but I remember the story from the pictures. My mom used to read it to me." Dr. Lucy says, "She must be proud of you. You've been such a brave boy." And then Peter says, "Thank you." And then Dr. Lucy says, "You're welcome." Again, good stuff. I gotta say, I like Jack, Janet, Frank, and Jason. They are all good characters in this movie. And Jack decides to get some sleep while the others get the results back, as Jack was awake for 24 straight hours and he needed some rest. We then cut to a scene where Jason wakes up, Jack saying, "We have the results." And then Jack looks at the chart and he says, 6 to 8 months, that cannot be correct. And then Janet says, "Those results are not in months, it's weeks." And then Jack tries warning the vice president, saying he should consider large-scale evacuations as it's only 6 to 8 weeks before eventually everything is completely screwed. Of course, the vice president ignores him and walks off. And I gotta say, I love the scene where 3 helicopters are flying and it is so cold that the inside of the helicopter starts to freeze, causing it to crash to the ground, as well as the other helicopters. And one man opens the helicopter door to escape, but he freezes to death in only seconds. Now it still is a statue. Terry then calls Jack and says, "Several hours ago, 3 helicopters went down in Scotland. They crashed because the fuel in their lines froze at negative 150 degrees Fahrenheit. And then he said it was the fastest temperature drop we had ever seen." And then Terry says on the phone, he basically asked Jack if he can help out. And Jack says he can, so Jack hangs up the phone. And after Jack says yes, Janet shows a radar photo of Scotland from 2 hours ago. Janet says hurricanes don't form over land. 44 minutes into the movie, Sam, Laura, and Brian and Laura's friend JD decide to get out of the hotel as JD has to get his little brother in Philadelphia. However, things go south, which I'll get to. It's been raining outside for 3 days straight, and the city is flooded with at least 12 inches of water. Also, the wolves that we saw less than 20 minutes into the movie that were in a cage inside a building with other caged animals are gone. which does lead to a part later, which we'll get to. Luther, the man with the dog who we saw earlier in the movie, who is homeless, walks inside a giant, basically walks inside a giant public library, holding 2 hot dogs he grabbed off a cart. However, the security guard tells him the dog cannot come in, and then Luther says, "Come on, man, it's pouring out there." And the guard says, "I don't care, read the sign." And I did not like the security guard. The way his attitude was very snarky, but luckily I can give it a pass because he's not in the movie for long. And then we cut to a scene with Sam, Laura, and Brian where they're heading to the big public library in water that at this point is 2.5 feet deep. We cut to a scene where a huge ocean tidal wave is heading for New York City, and it starts to cover the Statue of Liberty. And I like the scene where the tidal wave knocks over a bus with people inside, knocking more people and cars over. Then there is the intense scene where a French woman accidentally forgot her purse in the car with a passport, so Laura decides to quickly go get it. And Sam sees a very large incoming tidal wave and yells Laura at the top of his lungs, and then he runs to save her, and he gets her just in time. Sam, Laura, Brian, Luther, his dog, and everyone who can runs inside the library, closing the door, runs upstairs, and water breaks open top windows, but it doesn't flood the top floor. Again, very intense scene. And Sam basically gets back to Terry with and Jack gets back to Terry with a forecast model of what 24 hours from now will look like, which is the next ice age, basically. And Terry says to Jack on the phone, "Save as much as you can," because Terry said that he was, he couldn't really do anything. And Jack asks, "What can I do?" And he says, "Save as many as you can." And what I really like about this movie is that it has great characters and a great cast and a good story, which is what you need to make a good disaster movie. And I feel like a lot of disaster movies lack that, but this is one of the better ones if you ask me. And I like how Jack happily reunites with his wife Lucy at the hospital, and they are determined to find Sam. Then, of course, there's the scene where Sam goes downstairs to call Jack on a payphone on a wall while water is flooding in, and Jack warns Sam to not go outside, and he tells him what happened in Scotland. And what I love about this movie, I love how, despite the dangerous risk, he is willing to go find his son and save him. And Jack says, "Do not go outside. Just burn whatever you can and try to wait it out. I will come for you." Very good scene. And after the water covers the phone and Sam swims to basically the water covers the phone and Sam swims to the stairs, and Laura says, "I thought you drowned." And because not long before then, basically Jack and his wife heard water on the phone and they thought their son drowned, and Lucy was crying saying, "Tell me he's gonna be okay," and Jack says he's gonna be okay. About 1 hour into the movie, Sam and everyone else in the library see a giant ship floating in the city, and Sam tells everyone in the library to not go outside, as a lot of people see some people walking on snow outside, and Sam basically yells, "If these people go outside, they will freeze to death." And then one of the guys says, "What's this nonsense?" And then Sam says, "It's not nonsense." And someone asks, and Sam says, "This storm is going to get worse, and the people who are caught in it will freeze to death." And then someone asks him where he's getting it from, and Sam says, "I'm getting this info from my dad, who is a climatologist who works for the government." But of course, no one listens to Sam other than a few people, which are, of course, his four of his, 3 of his friends and 1 woman, and that woman's wife, and the woman's name is Ella. And I gotta say, I love the scene where Jack and Jason are in a dangerous situation, and Frank decides to sacrifice himself to save Jack and Jason, as if he did not sacrifice himself, all 3 of them would have died, considering the circumstances. Very powerful scene. If you've seen the movie, you know what scene I'm talking about. And Ella reads a book as Laura does not feel well, and they find out that Laura has an infected cut on her leg that needs medical treatment. So Sam and Brian go on the large ship from earlier, as now the snow is strong enough and deep enough to walk on, they go on the ship to see if there's a medical kit that they can retrieve. And the wolves that escaped the cage earlier, I mentioned, basically hear them being a little too loud. And so the wolves decide to chase after Brian and Sam in a very good, intense chase scene. And I like the scene where Sam and Brian start to see the top. I like the scene where Sam and Brian start to see the top of a very tall building begin to freeze fast, so they run inside to safety, and Jack starts to notice this too, so Jack opens up a sealed top door and he gets inside safely so he doesn't freeze to death. Then Sam and everyone in the fire room puts as much books as they can into the fire to stop the room from freezing, so they as a result do not freeze to death. And Jason wakes up and Jack informs him what happened to Jason as Jason passed out. And, and they are inside a warm room. And I gotta say, I like the scene with Jason and Jack walking, and we see the Statue of Liberty covered in the snow, which is on the poster of this movie. Now, granted, not necessarily the Blu-ray that I own, like I own this movie on Blu-ray. I mean, don't get me wrong, I like this cover, but I kind of wish I would have gotten the cover with the Statue of Liberty, but oh well, it is what it is. But a lot of the posters had that on it, which is pretty cool. Then Jack and Jason walk into the library and find Sam and everyone else asleep in the room by the fire pit. And, and Jack shines a flashlight on Sam's face, and then Sam wakes up and Sam says, "Dad," happy to see him as well as everyone else. The movie ends on a happy note with Sam, Jack, and everyone else in the helicopter all happy to see each other. And the vice president even admits that he was wrong and he's grateful for people's hospitality. And Lucy is, of course, ecstatic to hear the news that Sam and Jack are alive. And I like the ending scene of the movie where we see a scene of Earth from space with half of the planet covered in snow. So yeah. At the end of the day, this is a pretty good disaster movie. If I have some issues with it, and these are small issues, like, if I have some issues for this movie and they're not minor, it is a little annoying, some of the character decisions at parts, like the vice president in particular. It's like, why wouldn't you, like the part with, the only issues I have are like some character decisions, like, why wouldn't, Laura tell them about her leg hurting, and or like the vice president not listening to Jack. And most of the CGI is good, but there is a scene or two where it doesn't look great. Like, for example, the whole scene with the CGI wolves that run into the door that Sam slams shut, like that CGI I don't think is really aged that well. But other than that, this is a rather good disaster movie I would recommend. And on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm going to give The Day After Tomorrow an 8 out of 10. So yeah. Anyways, guys, that was my review on The Day After Tomorrow. I hope you guys enjoyed this review. And yeah, we'll talk to you guys later. Bye.